Welcome back to our History Under Review Explainer series. This is part 3, Columbus, Bobadilla, and the Evidence. Today we're asking a pretty vital question. What are we actually looking at when we review the evidence against Christopher Columbus? Let's dive right in. Okay, so before we can even start debating what the famous Bobadilla inquiry actually proves, we kind of need to take a step back from all the modern noise. We have to ask a much more fundamental question. How do we actually verify a 500-year-old accusation? I mean, it sounds simple enough, right? But when you're dealing with historical claims that have been simplified and repeated over and over, the messy reality of history easily gets buried. We hear a story enough times, and we just naturally start to assume the underlying evidence is as clear as a modern court transcript. But spoiler alert, it almost never is. You see, in every investigation, we have to carefully separate a settled historical fact from a hostile archival allegation. It is absolutely crucial to untangle what is actually documented from what is merely claimed, and what is interpreted from what is genuinely uncertain. Why? Because the core rule of our investigation today is incredibly simple but incredibly strict. No visible document, no settled historical conviction. Period. A claim might be world famous, it might literally be in every single textbook, but it still needs rigorous review. To really understand the gap between myth and reality, let's walk down what I like to call the evidence ladder. Usually we start all the way at the top with a modern media summary. You know, the catchy headline, the tweet, maybe a quick intro. But to find the actual truth, we have to climb down. We move through layers of scholarly interpretation, down to modern translations, down to published transcriptions, archival citations, all the way down to the absolute bedrock, the physical original manuscript itself. And honestly, the bigger the historical claim, the higher our standard of evidence has to be. We just can't accept a modern summary as bedrock proof without walking all the way down that ladder. And this brings us right to the public burden of proof. For almost 20 years now, modern claims about Columbus's tyranny have rested incredibly heavily on this one source, the Bobadilla inquiry. In popular history, it's frequently presented as this slam-dunk, open-and-shut conviction. But here is the catch, and it's a big one. Our public access to this source is entirely mediated. We don't just get to pull up the original parchment on our screens. Instead, we are relying completely on modern scholars who have read, deciphered, and interpreted 500-year-old handwriting on our behalf. That is a massive amount of trust placed between the public and the historical event. This dynamic is brilliantly illustrated by how we currently access this information. Right now, we rely on a real, published book by Consuelo Varela featuring a transcription by paleographer Isabel Aguirre. Now, don't get me wrong, this is serious top-tier academic work. Varela's prologue makes it clear that Aguirre found the document in a bundle, did the painstaking work of transcribing it, and provided a copy. That is incredibly valuable scholarship, but it still puts a significant layer between us and the original archive. A published transcription is ultimately an interpretation of handwriting. It's not the same thing as independent public verification of the source. Now, to its credit, the book clearly anchors the document at the Archivo General de Simancas and gives us a highly specific archival shelf mark. That's fantastic. It proves this document isn't just imaginary, it exists in a real physical space. But, and this is a really critical distinction, a shelf mark is basically just a coordinate on a map. It anchors a source, sure, but it doesn't, by itself, verify every single line of a printed text for the public. Knowing a document lives in a specific box in Spain doesn't mean we know exactly what every ink stroke on the page says without actually seeing it for ourselves. Okay, here's where the physical evidence gets a little complicated and honestly, a bit mysterious. The surviving text we have, it isn't even the original year 1500 field report written in Santo Domingo. It's a copy, and it was made years later, somewhere between 1504 and May 1506. Even more concerning, the very first folio is officially missing. That's huge, because the first page is exactly where you'd normally find all the identifying routing data and procedural info. We just don't have a continuous verified chain of custody from the Caribbean in 1500 to the archives in Spain today. It's a plausible archival path, yes, but there's a frustrating gap in the physical history of this paperwork. But let's say the transcription is 100% perfect. We still have to critically examine what this document actually is. It was a pesquisa, a formal official inquiry. Francisco de Bobadilla wasn't some neutral modern judge sitting in a quiet, orderly courtroom. He arrived, literally took over Columbus's house, and started gathering sworn statements in a highly hostile, incredibly politically charged environment. The witnesses were speaking from inside an active conflict. And let's be real, many of them had deep personal incentives to minimize their own questionable conduct or just shift the blame entirely onto Columbus to save their own skins. As this translator's note points out, a pesquisa records formal, evidentiary proceedings. It's a very specific type of early modern legal tool. But listen, an accusation recorded in the year 1500 doesn't magically transform into an objective, indisputable fact today just because someone wrote it down with a quill. A witness might be giving evidence under oath, sure, but that evidence still has to be carefully weighed against their motives, their political alliances, and the extreme circumstances of the interrogation itself.
So the crucial takeaway here is this. Statements made by Columbus's enemies during this inquiry have to be treated strictly as allegations requiring independent corroboration. They are not settled verdicts. The inquiry absolutely records hostile testimony against Columbus and his brothers, there's no doubt about that. But true historical judgment requires deep context and relentless source criticism. We simply cannot treat hostile historical testimony as automatic fact, no matter how neatly it happens to align with modern narratives.
So, where does our public access status actually stand right now? Let's review the layers. We've got a verified published transcription, and we have an archival shelf mark. That's the good news. But we do not have a verified public item-level catalog record, and we absolutely do not have full, public manuscript images available for independent review. Without those raw images, we just can't claim true image-level public verification. The chain of evidence stops short of total transparency.
And this brings us to a fundamental challenge of historical justice. Honestly, it's the guiding principle of this entire series. A document used to overturn or permanently stain a major historical reputation should be made visible, not merely cited. Think about it. If this testimony is going to be used as a public conviction, repeating the same damning quotes year after year, then the public deserves to see the complete manuscript folio by folio. A footnote in an academic book is simply not enough when the historical stakes are this high.
So how do we actually close that gap? Well, we need to meet a real, uncompromising public standard of proof. That means demanding complete digital reproductions of all surviving folios, both recto and verso. It means securing official catalog records, full conservation notes, paper and watermark analysis, and doing an independent paleographic comparison against the existing transcription. In fact, just to push this standard forward and move from theory to action, a formal request has already been drafted to the Archivo General de Simancas asking for exactly these digital reproductions. We are actively pushing for full visibility.
So what's our final takeaway for today? Until that public standard of proof is fully met and the manuscript is entirely visible to the world, we must treat the Bobadilla inquiry strictly as an important, mediated scholarly transcription. We remain perfectly neutral here. We aren't defending Columbus, and we aren't condemning him either. We just simply demand that sweeping historical claims be backed by visible, unmediated evidence, because right now, the contents of this document are uncorroborated allegations, not settled objective proof. Which leaves us with one massive, lingering question that we absolutely have to tackle in our next explainer. If this investigator, Francisco de Bobadilla, arrived in the Caribbean, took over Columbus's house, and completely upended the governance of the New World, who exactly was he? What were his motivations? Join me next time as we review the man behind the inquiry. See you then!